church bell tolls. Another coffin is lowered into the ground. Mourners gather in silence, their breath clouding in the cold English air. But their eyes are not fixed on the grave. They are fixed on her, Mary Ann Cotton. Draped in black, her gloved hands folded neatly, her face wet with practiced tears. She has stood at too many gravesides, too many husbands, too many children, too many lives snuffed out under her roof. At first, neighbors pitied her. How cruel that fate could curse one woman with so much tragedy. But pity has curdled into suspicion. Whispers rustle through the churchyard like the wind through dead leaves. Another one gone? Always the same sickness. Always her, always her. The pattern is undeniable. Death follows Mary Ann like a shadow, and yet she remains untouched, comforted by insurance money, moving on to the next home, the next husband, the next victim. What no one dares say aloud, not yet, is that this grieving widow is no victim at all. She is the cause. Behind those solemn eyes lies calculation. Behind the gentle touch, poison. Her weapon is invisible, tasteless, and easily explained away by doctors as gastric fever. Arsenic, hidden in the tea, sprinkled in the porridge, slow, agonizing, and almost impossible to detect. For years she drifts from town to town, leaving behind a trail of fresh graves and unanswered questions. By the time she is caught, the body count will number in the dozens. Husbands, lovers, stepchildren, even her own flesh and blood. And yet, in Victorian England, her story is more than one of murder. It is a story of poverty, of greed, of a society unprepared for a killer who looked like every other weary housewife. A story that reveals how the perfect mask of domestic respectability could hide a predator. Mary Ann Cotton would come to be known as the Black Widow of England, a woman whose life was a string of funerals and whose death shook the nation. This is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of how death, dressed in black lace, walked unnoticed among the living. To understand Mary Ann Cotton, we must first step into the world she inhabited, Victorian England. It was a time of rapid change, where the soot of industry stained the skies and poverty seeped into every alleyway. Families crammed into damp brick terraces, children ran barefoot through coal dust, and disease claimed lives without warning. Death was so common that a coffin maker could hardly keep up with demand. High mortality was expected, even accepted. Typhoid, cholera, scarlet fever, these were the names that haunted households. A child could die suddenly, a husband could fall ill overnight, and neighbors would simply nod, whispering, "It's God's will." And in this world of sickness and shadow, one element stood silently in the background: arsenic. Sold openly in shops as rat poison, mixed into household products like wallpaper dye and candles, arsenic was everywhere. Tasteless, odorless, and deadly, it was known as the inheritance powder, a poison perfectly suited for those with dark intentions. Medicine, meanwhile, was primitive. A doctor's diagnosis often rested on guesswork, with gastric fever being a convenient explanation for sudden stomach pains, vomiting, and death. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning mirrored those of natural disease so closely that few questioned it. And in this society, the role of women was one of obedience and invisibility. A good wife was expected to keep house, bear children, and suffer in silence. Their voices rarely carried weight in courtrooms or newspapers. This invisibility gave women like Mary Ann Cotton a unique cover. Who would suspect a grieving widow? Who would accuse a mother mourning her child? The conditions were perfect. A country drowning in poverty, a medicine blind to poison, a culture blind to the power women could wield. It was in this grim landscape that Mary Ann began her life, a seemingly ordinary girl who would grow into something extraordinary and monstrous. Mary Ann Robson was born in October of 1832 in the small village of Low Moorsley, County Durham. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about her beginnings. She was the daughter of a colliery sinker, one of the countless men who dug deep into England's coal seams, often never returning alive. Her childhood was steeped in the soot and hardship of mining life. The Robson family lived modestly, bound by strict Methodist values, discipline, obedience, and the looming presence of hellfire sermons shaped her early years. But beneath the piety and poverty, young Mary Ann was said to have a restless nature, a hunger for something more than the grim predictability of village life. Tragedy came early. When Mary Ann was only a child, her father fell to his death in a mining accident. It was an all-too-common fate in the pits of Victorian England, but for the Robson family, it was catastrophic. Her mother, left to raise the children alone, remarried quickly, a decision that did not sit well with Mary Ann. She reportedly despised her stepfather, and tensions at home grew sharp. Resentment festered, and with it, the seeds of something darker. Despite these hardships, Mary Ann appeared outwardly respectable. She was described as a pretty girl, neat, polite, and well-mannered. Villagers saw in her the makings of a dutiful wife and mother. But appearances can deceive. That mask of domestic virtue would serve her well in years to come. By her teens, Mary Ann had taken up work as a nursemaid and later as a dressmaker, professions that placed her in close contact with both families and their vulnerabilities. She was learning, perhaps unconsciously, how trust could be won, and how easily it could be betrayed. Those early losses, her father's death, the bitter presence of a stepfather, the grinding poverty, formed the crucible that shaped Mary Ann. She had known what it meant to be powerless, and she had tasted the bitterness of want. Some say this drove her to seek security at any cost. Others believe the cruelty was always inside her, waiting for opportunity. What is certain is this: by the time Mary Ann reached adulthood, she had perfected the art of blending in. To her neighbors she was ordinary. To those closest to her, she was a loving wife-to-be. But lurking beneath was a woman who would turn domestic life into a theater of death. In 1852, at the age of 20, Mary Ann Robson married her first husband, William Mowbray. On the surface, it was the beginning of a typical Victorian household. William worked for the railways and as a miner. Mary Ann settled into her role as wife and mother. Soon the family grew quickly. By some accounts, up to 9 children were born to the couple. But tragedy struck with cruel repetition. Child after child fell ill, suffering agonizing stomach pains, vomiting, and fever before slipping into death. At first, neighbors and doctors saw nothing unusual. Infant mortality in Victorian England was heartbreakingly common. A grieving mother burying her children was a sad but familiar sight. Yet in Mary Ann's case, the pattern was extreme. By the time she and William had been married for little more than a decade, most of their children were dead. And then, in 1865, William himself fell ill with the same dreadful symptoms. He, too, was carried to the grave. Mary Ann was left a widow, but not destitute. William had held a life insurance policy, and upon his death, Mary Ann collected the payout. For a woman of her station, the sum was significant. It cushioned her against the poverty that loomed over most widows of the time. Here we see the beginnings of a pattern that would define her life. Misfortune struck again and again, but Mary Ann seemed to emerge with something in hand: insurance money, relief from financial burdens, and the freedom to move on to her next opportunity. And yet, behind Mary Ann's veil of grief, the truth was darker. Arsenic was her hidden ally. Readily available at the local shop, tasteless and odorless, it was the perfect murder weapon. With William gone and the insurance collected, Mary Ann was free to move forward. Soon, she would remarry, start again, and the cycle of death would repeat itself. After the death of William Mowbray, Mary Ann did not stay a widow for long. Poverty was the great enemy of Victorian women, and marriage was often the only shield against it. But for Mary Ann, husbands became more than companions. They became opportunities. Her second known marriage was to George Ward, a former patient of hers. George was already in poor health when they wed in 1865. Soon after, his condition worsened. He began suffering violent stomach pains, vomiting, and weakness. Friends assumed it was his lingering illness. But in truth, Mary Ann's quiet hand was at work. Within a year, George Ward was dead. Once again, Mary Ann benefited from an insurance payout. Next came James Robinson, a wealthy widower from Sunderland. Mary Ann was employed as his housekeeper after the death of his wife. She moved in, caring for his surviving children, but almost immediately tragedy struck. One of Robinson's young daughters died unexpectedly while under Mary Ann's care. Suspicious whispers began to surface, but James, perhaps blinded by grief and loneliness, married her in 1867. The marriage was turbulent. Robinson discovered that Mary Ann was stealing from him, and their relationship deteriorated quickly. More children died in her care, including their own newborn. Eventually, Robinson threw her out, refusing to insure his life under her insistence. In doing so, he may have saved himself from becoming her next victim. By now, Mary Ann's pattern was crystallizing. Wherever she went, death followed. Husbands, stepchildren, even her own offspring. She would nurse them through mysterious illnesses, gaining sympathy and appearing the devoted caregiver. But behind the curtains, she was feeding them arsenic, an invisible executioner hidden in meals and drinks. Mary Ann then set her sights on Frederick Cotton, another widower. They married in 1870, and she took his surname, a name that would forever be tied to her own infamy. Once again, children in the household began to fall ill and die. Frederick himself soon followed, leaving Mary Ann with yet another insurance policy. By now, the cycle was grotesquely familiar. A husband would die. Children would die. Mary Ann would collect her payout, pack her things, and move on. Each time she wore the mask of grief, blending seamlessly into a society accustomed to death. But her ambition stretched even further. After Frederick's death, she became involved with a man named Joseph Nattrass, a former lover. He too would eventually die under her roof. She even took in a lodger, only for him to sicken and perish in the same agonizing manner. And then, chillingly, she turned against her own surviving children. The deaths of her biological sons and daughters shocked even those who had pitied her. Some believed she could not bear the burden of mouths to feed. Others suggested that the insurance money, tiny sums for each child, was enough motive in her desperate world. Whatever her reasons, Mary Ann Cotton became not only a husband killer, but a mother who murdered her own flesh and blood. By the early 1870s, suspicion was rising. Doctors and neighbors noticed the uncanny repetition of gastric fever wherever she lived. Yet still, she remained free, the perfect mask of domestic respectability shielding her from accusations. The Black Widow's web was growing larger, but it was also tightening around her. Her greed and cruelty would eventually push her too far, and the whispers of suspicion would turn into a full investigation. Mary Ann Cotton did not kill in a frenzy. She killed with patience, with calculation, with a method so ordinary, so invisible, that for years she was able to hide in plain sight. Her weapon of choice was arsenic, a poison sold over the counter in Victorian England. It was used to kill rats, to treat vermin infestations, even to color wallpaper and fabrics. It was everywhere, and yet nowhere, because once ingested it left few traces. The brilliance of arsenic lay in its symptoms. Nausea, stomach cramps, diarrhea, vomiting. Every sign could be mistaken for common gastric illness, which ran rampant in poor, unsanitary towns. Doctors rarely questioned it. They scribbled gastric fever on death certificates while Mary Ann, dressed in black, accepted condolences at yet another funeral. But Mary Ann's real genius was not only in the poison, it was in her performance. She played her roles with chilling perfection. The grieving widow, the devoted nurse, the heartbroken mother. She would sit at the bedside of her victims, spooning medicine between bouts of vomiting, medicine she had laced herself. Neighbors saw a woman of duty and endurance, nursing the sick even as tragedy visited her again and again. Behind that mask was a woman driven by two hungers, money and control. The life insurance policies, though modest, gave her independence in a world where most women had none. Each death brought her not only financial relief, but freedom to pursue the next man, the next home, the next step up the ladder. For Mary Ann, Marriage was not a bond of love. It was a transaction, and death was the closing of the deal. She was also skilled at manipulation. When challenged, she lied with ease, weaving stories of misfortune. She persuaded neighbors to vouch for her. She pressured men into taking out insurance policies, and when they hesitated, she found ways to convince them. Even when rumors swirled, she slipped away before suspicion could take root. To those around her, Mary Ann seemed cursed, haunted by death at every turn. But in truth, she was the storm itself, weaving her web wider and wider. Husbands, lovers, children, lodgers, none were safe once she set her sights on them. Yet greed has no brakes. Her appetite for money, for insurance, for survival at any cost, pushed her to take greater risks. And each death drew her closer to exposure. The web she wove so carefully was beginning to fray. It would not be a suspicious neighbor or a grieving husband that brought her down, but a child. And in the tiny body of that child, the first real cracks in Mary Ann Cotton's facade would finally appear. By the early 1870s, Mary Ann Cotton had woven a tapestry of death that stretched across the north of England. Husbands, lovers, stepchildren, even her own blood, all gone. And yet, somehow, she still walked free. Doctors had written gastric fever so many times it had become routine. Neighbors shook their heads at her endless misfortune, but no one dared accuse her outright. But then came the death that would undo her. In 1872, Mary Ann was living with Frederick Cotton's family, even after his death. She was caring for his children, and soon she began an affair with a man named Joseph Nattrass, who eventually moved into the household. One by one, Frederick's children sickened and died. But one survived long enough to raise alarm. Charles Edward Cotton, Frederick's young son. Mary Ann complained bitterly about the boy. She told neighbors and friends that he was a burden, that she wished he was gone. Her words were not whispers, she spoke them openly. And when she pressed the local parish officer about sending the child to the workhouse, she was reminded, if Charles died, she would receive his small insurance payout. Those words, too blunt, too careless, were overheard. Suspicion turned to action. When Charles Edward Cotton suddenly fell ill and died with the familiar symptoms, stomach cramps, vomiting, exhaustion, the authorities could no longer ignore the whispers. The local coroner ordered an inquest. For the first time in Mary Ann's long career of death, a body would be examined with true suspicion. An autopsy was performed, and what they found was damning. Traces of arsenic in the child's stomach. Not disease, not bad luck, poison. The walls of Mary Ann's carefully constructed world began to collapse. Neighbors came forward with stories of her strange remarks, her sudden financial gains, her relentless trail of funerals. Doctors revisited their cases, realizing that the endless gastric fevers might have been something far more sinister. Even her surviving lover, Joseph Nattrass, would not escape suspicion. For years, Mary Ann had moved unseen, hiding in the blind spots of medicine and society. But now, Victorian science, primitive though it was, had caught up with her. Chemical tests could reveal arsenic, and they had. Mary Ann Cotton was arrested, accused of murdering young Charles Edward Cotton. And once the investigation began, it was impossible to stop. Everywhere the police looked, they found the same pattern. Families destroyed, policies collected, lives ended in the same dreadful way. The Black Widow's web had finally been exposed, and the trial that followed would grip the nation, turning Mary Ann Cotton into a figure of both horror and fascination. The year was 1873. The name Mary Ann Cotton was no longer whispered in the corners of village churchyards. It blared across the pages of newspapers. Reporters called her the Black Widow, a woman whose trail of poisoned husbands and children horrified the Victorian imagination. For a society steeped in strict morality, the idea of a mother and wife deliberately murdering those closest to her was almost too monstrous to comprehend. Her trial was held at Durham Assizes, and the courtroom filled with spectators. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others to see justice served. Women gasped in disbelief, men muttered about the unnatural wickedness of it all. Few had ever seen a female criminal placed so squarely in the spotlight. The charge was specific: the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, her young stepson. But as the prosecution laid out its case, the jury and the public heard far more. Doctors testified to the symptoms that plagued Charles and so many others under Mary Ann's care: the cramps, the vomiting, the rapid decline. Chemists confirmed the presence of arsenic in the boy's body. Then came the damning statements of neighbors. They recalled Mary Ann speaking of the boy as a burden, remarking that he would soon go the way of the others. They repeated her careless confession that she stood to benefit from his death. These words, combined with the cold science of the autopsy, painted a picture too dark to ignore. Mary Ann sat in the dock, calm and composed. To some, she looked almost indifferent. To others, her poise was proof of her cunning. When asked to speak, she denied everything, insisting she was the victim of slander and coincidence. But few believed her. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes before returning with their verdict: guilty. The courtroom erupted, some gasping, others nodding grimly. Mary Ann Cotton, who had walked free from so many funerals, would not escape this one. The judge pronounced the sentence, death by hanging. A fitting, if grim, end for the woman now etched in history as England's most infamous Black Widow. On the morning of March 24, 1873, the prison yard at Durham Gaol filled with anticipation. Word had spread quickly. Mary Ann Cotton, the Black Widow, was to hang. Crowds gathered outside the prison walls, some eager for justice, others for the morbid thrill of witnessing history. Inside her cell, Mary Ann remained composed. Reports describe her as quiet, almost resigned. Dressed in black, as she had so often been in life, she walked steadily toward the scaffold. To the last, she maintained her innocence, insisting she had been wronged. But the time for words had passed. The hangman, William Calcraft, was infamous in his own right, a man known for his botched executions, and Mary Ann Cotton would not be spared his incompetence. As the noose was placed around her neck and the trapdoor opened, the drop was miscalculated. Instead of a swift death, Mary Ann dangled, choking and convulsing before the horrified eyes of witnesses. The execution that should have lasted seconds stretched into minutes, her body twitching as the rope slowly strangled the life from her. Some said it was fitting that a woman who had dealt such prolonged suffering to others now endured her own. When at last she was pronounced dead, silence fell over the prison yard. One of England's most notorious killers had met her end. For the crowds outside, the story of Mary Ann Cotton became legend, a tale of greed, poison, and death, wrapped in the guise of domesticity. She had walked calmly into countless funerals, but on this day she had attended her own. When Mary Ann Cotton's body was cut down from the scaffold at Durham Gaol, her life ended, but her story did not. In fact, it had only just begun to etch itself into English folklore. Victorian society was shaken. The newspapers had sensationalized every detail, branding her the Black Widow, the female fiend, and even the most wicked woman in Britain. For a public already fascinated with crime, Mary Ann became both a warning and an obsession. People asked themselves how such evil could hide behind the face of a respectable housewife. Her crimes forced doctors, coroners, and lawmakers to reconsider the ease with which arsenic could be obtained. No longer was it seen as a simple household tool, it was now understood as a weapon. Cases like Mary Ann's pushed for tighter restrictions on poisons and for advances in forensic toxicology. Detecting arsenic in the body became a priority, a way to guard against the silent epidemic of inheritance powder. Culturally, Mary Ann became a figure of dread. Children's rhymes in the north of England carried her name: Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten, a macabre chant that kept her memory alive for generations. In taverns and around kitchen fires, her tale was retold as both cautionary horror and morbid entertainment. But perhaps the most unsettling part of her legacy is the uncertainty. Historians estimate she may have killed as many as 21 people, though the true number will never be known. The gaps in record-keeping, the trust placed in doctors' assumptions, and the ease with which she moved from town to town mean that much of her body count is lost to history. Mary Ann Cotton left behind more than graves. She left behind a lingering question. How many killers like her went unnoticed in the Victorian era? How many widows wept crocodile tears while arsenic seeped into their victims' veins? Her execution closed her life, but it did not close the case of human cruelty. Instead, it opened a window into the darkness that can dwell within the ordinary. Mary Ann Cotton's tale is not just the story of a murderer. It is the story of how death can hide in plain sight, how grief can be staged, how trust can be twisted, and how ordinary facades can conceal extraordinary darkness. In life, she was a nurse, a wife, a mother. Roles society associates with care and love. Yet she used those roles as weapons, turning homes into silent graveyards. Her victims were not strangers. They were the people who trusted her most. That is what makes her crimes so chilling. The betrayal of the bonds that should have been sacred. Her legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Greed, desperation, and cruelty are not confined to monsters in the shadows. They can live behind polite smiles and black veils of mourning. In Victorian England, society was unprepared for a killer like Mary Ann Cotton. The question is, are we any more prepared today? History remembers her as the Black Widow of England, but perhaps the greater lesson is this: evil often wears the mask of the familiar. If you found this story haunting, explore more with us. Subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten crimes of history, and remember, sometimes the dead have darker stories to tell than the living.